I inherit a family ranch in Texas. My greedy son and his snobby wife try to have me declared incompetent using fake medical records. I find a loophole in the original land grant that makes me the sole legal trustee, voiding all claims, and I sell the land to a wind farm for millions. Hello, everyone. I'm Margaret, and today I have a story that might just make your jaw drop. You know, sometimes life hands you the kind of trouble that feels like it was cooked up by some writer for a daytime drama. But this was all too real. It all started when I inherited the family ranch in Texas. A sprawling, sun-beaten piece of land my grandfather had worked from dawn till dusk, a place full of memories of horses, wide-open skies, and Sunday barbecues. I never expected it would become the battlefield for one of the most vicious family feuds I'd ever been in. I'm not exactly what you'd call a high-maintenance woman. I've spent most of my adult life raising my children, running a small interior design business, and enjoying my garden. I like quiet mornings with coffee in my favorite mug, the kind with a little chip on the rim, and afternoons spent watching the sunset over my little backyard. But suddenly, all that peace disappeared the moment my lawyer handed me the will and a stack of legal documents thicker than a Texas phone book. The ranch. My grandfather's ranch. My responsibility. And suddenly, the people I should have been able to trust the most, the ones who were supposed to be family, decided they wanted it too. My son, Ryan, and his wife, Vanessa, apparently had plans that didn't include me. They were, well, let's say, ambitious, greedy even. I always knew Vanessa was a bit, shall we say, snobby, but I never imagined she'd stoop to what she did. It all started with a phone call. I remember it clearly. I had just finished pruning my roses, my hands scratched and dirt under my nails, when the phone rang. "Mum," Ryan said, trying for that tone he thinks makes him sound reasonable. "We need to talk about the ranch. It's complicated, in their language, meant trouble. In my language, it meant betrayal." By the next week, I had letters, phone calls, and emails piling up. They were alleging I was incapable of managing the ranch, that I was too old, too frail, and, believe it or not, medically incompetent. My first reaction? Laugh. Out loud. I mean, I had a knee that creaked in the mornings, and maybe my hair wasn't what it used to be, but medically incompetent? That stung more than I expected. And the kicker? They had evidence. Fake medical records, doctored letters from doctors I'd never seen, and a whole package of nonsense designed to make a judge think I couldn't even sign a check without falling over. The whole situation made me feel like I was in one of those old courtroom dramas I watched on TV. You know the ones, the dramatic pauses, the whispered conversations, the lawyers in suits that make them look like they belong on a soap opera set. And believe me, it felt just like that. My son, the boy I once taught to ride a horse, the boy I cheered for at every soccer game, was suddenly plotting to strip me of my inheritance. And Vanessa, well, Vanessa's eyes always had that glint when she thought she was getting what she wanted. I remembered the first time I met her at the engagement party, how she sized up my house, my furniture, my everything, and I realized she was the kind of person who believed that nothing I had was ever quite good enough. I won't lie, I was scared. Scared, yes, but also furious. How could they think I would just hand over my family's legacy? My grandfather had worked that land when it was nothing but brush and dirt. He had fought droughts, floods, and wildfires, and here were my own flesh and blood, trying to erase me with some cleverly forged papers. The thought made my hands shake, and I spent that night pacing my living room, coffee forgotten, staring out the window at the moonlight reflecting off the little pond in my backyard. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't just sit there and let them steamroll me. I called my attorney, Helen, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who's been my friend and legal guide for over 20 years. She listened to my story, nodding like she'd heard it all before. which, in her career, she probably had. "Margaret," she said, "this isn't just a family squabble. This is a full-blown attack on your rights. But don't worry, we're going to fight." And fight we would. We started by combing through every document, every letter, every so-called medical record they had presented. It was obvious that someone had gone to a lot of trouble, hiring some shady individuals to create convincing paperwork. But I learned something important through the process. Just because someone has resources doesn't mean they have truth on their side. And truth, in this case, was on my side. I had memories, signatures, deeds, and most importantly, the original land grant that my grandfather had worked under. That old document would turn out to be my ace in the hole. I spent days revisiting the ranch, walking the fields, feeling the familiar crunch of dry grass beneath my boots. It was grounding, reminding me what I was fighting for. Each gust of wind through the mesquite trees felt like a reminder that the land belonged to me, and it always would. I even started jotting down notes, talking to old neighbors, people who had known my grandfather for decades, gathering every scrap of evidence that proved I had the right to be there, alive and in control. Then came the confrontation. Ryan and Vanessa thought they could catch me off guard, maybe intimidate me into signing over some kind of temporary control. I invited them over for dinner, my idea of turning the tables. I cooked their favorite dishes, set the table like it was a family reunion, and listened as they tried, oh so subtly, to twist the conversation to get me to admit I was not well enough to make decisions. I smiled, poured the wine, and kept my eyes steady. I'd never felt more alive and more determined. That night, I realized something crucial. I wasn't just defending land. I was defending my dignity, my memory of my family, and the sense of self I'd spent a lifetime building. I wasn't going to let fake papers and false claims erase decades of love, hard work, and integrity. And I had a feeling that the next few weeks were going to be full of surprises. Some of them, I hoped, in my favor. Because, as I learned that evening, the most dangerous thing my son and his wife had underestimated was me. And me, I was just getting started. The days after that dinner were a whirlwind of phone calls, letters, and visits from people I barely remembered having met. My mailbox became a mini battleground, stuffed with documents that made my head spin. There were letters from lawyers I didn't recognize, warnings from banks, and even a notice from a local HOA. Not that I'd lived in a HOA neighborhood for decades, but apparently Vanessa had managed to involve them too, claiming my neglect of the ranch was a threat to the neighborhood. I laughed at that one. The only neglect happening on that ranch was from anyone who didn't respect its history. But I knew laughter alone wasn't going to stop them. Helen came by that afternoon, carrying a huge folder that rattled when she set it down on my kitchen table. "Margaret," she said, giving me that look she always gives when I try to hide my worry, "you're in deeper than you realize. But there's hope." I leaned back in my chair, gripping the edge, because hope felt like the first real thing I'd heard in weeks. She laid out the strategy, slowly and carefully, pointing to a stack of papers I'd almost missed, the original land grant. My grandfather had held onto it for decades, long before anyone dreamed of subdivisions, wind farms, or lawyers spinning lies. And apparently this grant had clauses that nobody, including Ryan and Vanessa, had bothered to notice. The loophole was buried in the fine print, the kind of old-fashioned legal language most people would skip over. It basically gave the legal trustee of the property sole control in the event of a family dispute. And crucially, it defined the trustee as whoever was appointed first under the original will. I nearly dropped my coffee when Helen explained it. If we could prove that I was the rightful trustee according to the old grant, all of their claims could be voided instantly. Suddenly, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like someone who had just found a secret weapon buried in plain sight. But finding the loophole was only half the battle. The tricky part was proving it in court, without giving Ryan and Vanessa the satisfaction of thinking they could intimidate me. I started spending mornings at the ranch, walking the old paths my grandfather used to walk, checking fences, looking at the barns, and talking to the neighbors. These weren't just casual chats. I was collecting stories, confirming details, and building my own evidence. Mrs. Larkin, the woman who had worked the ranch back in the 70s, remembered my grandfather's words about the original grant, about how it was meant to stay in the family under one caretaker. Her testimony alone could be invaluable. Of course, Ryan and Vanessa weren't idle. The tension in my phone calls with Ryan was unbearable. His voice dripped with condescension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. "Mum, you don't understand how serious this is," he said during one call. "We just want what's best for the ranch." I knew better. "No, Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You want what's best for you." There was silence on the line, a brief pause where I imagined him realizing I wasn't going to be pushed around. But I knew it was just the calm before the storm. Then came the day the first official challenge arrived. I opened my mailbox to find a certified letter from a law firm in Dallas, thick with legal jargon, claiming that I had been demonstrated as legally incompetent and demanding that I relinquish control of the ranch immediately. I stared at it for a long time, letting my eyes trace the words, feeling the heat rise in my chest. My hands shook slightly, not from fear this time, but from anger. I thought about all the summers spent on that land, all the times I had ridden the fence lines with my grandfather teaching me about responsibility, about patience, about respect. And suddenly, all of that history felt like it was being trampled by greed. That evening, Helen and I sat down and went through the letter line by line. She explained every bit of legalese, translating it into plain English so I could understand exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to trap me into signing something without realizing the consequences, to make it seem like I had agreed to their demands. But Helen had a plan. She was going to file a formal response, citing the original land grant, and challenge the authenticity of the medical records they had presented. And I realized, with a strange mix of excitement and dread, that this was going to be one of the most intense fights of my life. I also had to steel myself emotionally. Fighting your own family is exhausting, mentally and physically. There were mornings I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Nights I couldn't stop replaying conversations in my head, analyzing every tone and every pause. I found myself talking out loud to the empty kitchen, practicing what I would say in court, imagining the looks on their faces when their plan unraveled. Sometimes I laughed at myself, feeling a little ridiculous, but I also felt alive in a way I hadn't for years. This was my moment to reclaim something I'd almost lost, not just land, but respect, dignity, and the memory of a family legacy. The next few weeks were a blur of research, phone calls, and trips to the county archives. I discovered records and handwritten notes my grandfather had left behind, proving that he had anticipated disputes like this, and that I, as the first appointed trustee, had legal authority over the property. Every document I uncovered felt like a small victory. Each one was a brick in the wall I was building to protect my inheritance. I also found references to land leases, water rights, and even early plans for energy development, things that would become incredibly important later. But for now, the focus was proving my competence and invalidating their fraudulent claims. And then, just when I thought the pressure couldn't get any higher, I received a call from an unexpected source, a former attorney who had worked with my grandfather. He remembered details about the land grant, about the intentions of my grandfather, and about clauses that were never used because no one had thought they would be needed. His words were like a lifeline. "Margaret," he said, "your grandfather protected this ranch for a reason. There's a legal path here. You just have to follow it carefully." I felt a surge of relief, mixed with renewed determination. I wasn't alone, and the odds weren't as grim as Ryan and Vanessa thought. By the end of that month, I had everything prepared for the first formal legal response. Helen and I reviewed it repeatedly, making sure every detail was airtight. I felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety as we filed it with the court. It was official. I wasn't backing down. Ryan and Vanessa were going to find out the hard way that you can't bulldoze your mother, or a legacy, without consequences. And somewhere deep down, I knew that the loophole in the original grant was about to turn the tide in my favor. That night, I stood on the porch of my little house, looking out across the horizon. The wind stirred the tall grass, and for a moment, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the rustle of the leaves, whispering that I was doing the right thing. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt in control. And that feeling, oh, that feeling, was worth more than all the money in the world. Court day arrived faster than I expected, and I'll admit, I was nervous. I woke up that morning with a flutter in my chest that felt like a mix of excitement and fear, the kind that makes your stomach do tiny somersaults. I had my outfit ready, a modest but sharp dress that made me feel like I could take on the world. And Helen reminded me more than once to take a deep breath, stay calm, and remember the facts. I did my best, but every time I looked in the mirror, I couldn't help imagining Ryan and Vanessa smirking somewhere, confident that they'd outmaneuver me. I refused to give them that satisfaction, not even a hint of worry in my voice. We arrived at the courthouse early. The building had that familiar scent of polished wood and old stone, the kind of place that makes you feel both small and significant at the same time. I kept telling myself, Margaret, this is your land, your legacy, your grandfather's dream. You are meant to be here. Helen led me inside, papers clutched firmly in her hand, her expression unreadable but confident. I clutched my purse like a talisman, and every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of generation was on my shoulders. The courtroom was surprisingly full. Family members I hadn't seen in years were there, along with neighbours and a few curious locals who had heard whispers about the dispute. I recognized faces that reminded me of summers long past, barbecue smoke in the air, laughter echoing through the fields, my grandfather tipping his hat with that quiet authority only he had. For a moment, I let myself breathe in that memory. I carried it with me like armor as the judge entered and the room quieted. The hearing began, and Ryan's lawyer went first. They laid out their argument with a kind of precision that was meant to intimidate. They spoke of questionable competency, of risk to the property, of how it would be in everyone's best interest if I relinquished control. I listened carefully, letting the words wash over me, imagining each claim being dismantled piece by piece. I wasn't here to argue based on emotion. I was here to prove facts, historical documents, and law. The fake medical records they presented were flimsy, poorly edited, and I could see the subtle signs of forgery immediately. Helen had already prepared to expose these weaknesses. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a surge of confidence. I stood, smoothing my dress, and looked around the room. Your Honour, I began, my voice steady. I am Margaret Thompson, granddaughter of James Thompson, the original owner of the ranch in question. I have cared for this land, honoured its legacy, and have legal documentation proving that I am the rightful trustee according to the original land grant. I could see the judge nod slightly, and I felt a small spark of hope. I went on, explaining the loophole in the grant, how it clearly defined the first appointed trustee, and how all of my son's claims were based on fraudulent documentation. I didn't rush, didn't raise my voice. I let the words carry the weight of truth. Ryan and Vanessa were visibly frustrated. I could see it in the way Ryan clenched his jaw, and Vanessa's fingers tapped nervously on the edge of her seat. They had assumed I would be intimidated by the courtroom, the legalese, the formality. They hadn't counted on me knowing my grandfather's land as well as I did, or on Helen's meticulous preparation. I presented the additional evidence we had gathered, The affidavits from neighbors, the old letters, even the testimony from my grandfather's former attorney. Each piece reinforced the claim that I was the sole legal trustee. The turning point came when Helen introduced the original land grant itself. She handed the document to the judge, explaining its history, the handwritten notes in the margins, and the explicit clause naming the first trustee as the one who would hold full authority in case of disputes. I watched the judge examine it closely, flipping the pages with careful attention, and I felt a thrill of vindication. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore. It was proof of everything my grandfather had intended, preserved through generations, now shining like a beacon of truth. Ryan's lawyer tried to counter, attempting to cast doubt on the document's authenticity. But Helen had anticipated this. She presented corroborating documents from the county archives, showing the land grant had been recorded officially and had never been altered. Then she brought in the expert witness, a historian who specialized in land grants and property law, to explain the legal significance of every clause in plain English. I watched as the tension in the room shifted. The scales were beginning to tip in my favor. The moment of triumph wasn't dramatic in a Hollywood sense. There were no gasps or fainting spells, but there was a sense of quiet justice in the room. The judge asked a few questions, careful and deliberate, then turned to Ryan and Vanessa. I could see them realize, perhaps for the first time, that their plan was unraveling. The documents they had forged, the threats they had made, they weren't enough to override decades of legal precedents, careful record-keeping, and truth. When the judge finally spoke, it was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. After reviewing the evidence, it is clear that Margaret Thompson is the rightful trustee of the Thompson Ranch, as stipulated in the original land grant. All claims to the contrary are hereby dismissed. I felt a rush of relief and triumph that made my knees weak. Ryan's jaw tightened, Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, and I realized something important. I had won, but I had also set the stage for the next steps, the ones that would secure my future and the ranch's legacy once and for all. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The sun was high in the Texas sky, warm against my face, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and promise. Helen walked beside me, smiling but reserved, knowing better than to let the moment get to our heads too much. "This is just the beginning," she reminded me. "You have full authority now, but decisions are coming that will define the future of this property." I nodded, fully aware that while I had won the legal battle, the story of the ranch and my family was far from over. That evening, back at the ranch, I wandered through the fields, feeling the soil under my boots, the sun dipping low over the horizon. I thought about my grandfather, about the summers I had spent learning from him, about the work, sweat, and love poured into this land. I felt connected to him in a way I hadn't before, realizing that I wasn't just a caretaker, I was part of a legacy, a link in a chain that stretched back through generations. And I knew, deep in my heart, that no one could take that away from me. Even so, I also knew that Ryan and Vanessa would not give up easily. The victory in court was a milestone, but there were other battles ahead, decisions about the future of the ranch, offers that could change everything, and the looming question of how to protect what I now legally owned from anyone else who might try to claim it. I went to bed that night exhausted, yet awake with anticipation, knowing that the story of the Thompson Ranch was entering its most exciting chapter yet. After the court victory, I expected a sense of relief to settle over me like a soft blanket. And in some ways, it did, but not entirely. Winning the legal battle was one thing, figuring out what to do next was another. I had the ranch, yes, but it wasn't just a piece of land. It was a living, breathing legacy with fences to fix, water lines to check, barns that had seen better days, and neighbors who had long memories and opinions. I realized quickly that being the legal trustee meant I had to make real decisions, practical ones, that would affect the land and everyone connected to it. I spent that first week walking the property from sunrise to sunset, my boots sinking into the soft soil, tracing the paths my grandfather used to ride. The ranch was quiet in a way that made me feel both at peace and vigilant. Peace because this land was mine to protect, and vigilant because I knew Ryan and Vanessa weren't going to disappear quietly into the background. I kept an eye on the farmhouse, the barns, the creeks, everything that could remind me of the life my grandfather had built. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, staring at the stars, thinking through every possible scenario. And then, just when I thought I could breathe for a moment, a letter arrived that made me nearly drop my tea. It was from a company I had never heard of, a wind energy developer interested in buying large tracts of land for wind farms. They'd apparently done their research and discovered the Thompson Ranch, noting its location, its open plains, and the unobstructed wind patterns. I stared at the letter, blinking as if the words might rearrange themselves into a dream. Sell the ranch? Millions of dollars? It seemed surreal, almost like my grandfather himself was smiling from beyond, telling me it was time for a new chapter. But of course, it wasn't that simple. The offer was attractive, yes, but there were details to consider. Environmental restrictions, zoning laws, the potential backlash from neighbors who still remembered the ranch as more than just land. They remembered it as a piece of family history, a place that carried memories, sweat, and pride. And then there was Ryan. I knew he'd try to claim some of that money, somehow, even though the court had clearly affirmed my authority. I took a deep breath and called Helen, who had become more than just my lawyer. She was my strategist, my confidant, and in many ways, my shield. Helen reviewed the proposal carefully. "Margaret," she said, leaning back in her chair and adjusting her glasses, "this could be an incredible opportunity. But we have to make sure your title is absolutely clear, that nothing else can challenge your authority." I nodded, feeling a rush of excitement and anxiety at the same time. The idea that I could finally turn this family feud into a financial victory, all while maintaining control over the ranch, was thrilling. But I knew I had to be careful. One misstep, one oversight, and Ryan and Vanessa might try to claw back into the picture. Over the next few days, I threw myself into research. I called energy consultants, read reports on land leasing, and even spoke with neighbors who had sold property to developers in the past. Each conversation reinforced what I had suspected. The ranch was uniquely positioned for a wind farm. The plains caught the wind in ways most other properties couldn't, and the land was flat enough to make construction feasible without destroying its natural beauty. Every meeting, every call, felt like piecing together a puzzle I hadn't realized I had all the pieces for. Still, the thought of Ryan meddling lingered. He'd tried underhanded tactics before, and I knew he could try again if he saw the wind farm as a way to make money. I reminded myself that I had the court's decision, the original land grant, and Helen's unwavering support. Together we could block any interference before it even started. But the realization made me hyper-aware of every move I made, every step I took. The ranch wasn't just land anymore. It was leverage, power, and security, all rolled into one. One afternoon, as I walked along the edge of the property where the wind whistled through the mesquite trees, I made a decision. I would proceed, but carefully. I would negotiate with the wind company, ensure the sale was structured in a way that secured my position, and protect the legacy my grandfather had entrusted to me. At the same time, I began documenting everything: emails, phone calls, site visits, conversations with consultants, building a paper trail that would make it impossible for Ryan and Vanessa to claim a single thing. I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that every detail I logged would be another layer of defense. Then came a twist I hadn't anticipated. One of the older neighbors, Mr. Hargrove, called me, his voice trembling with a mix of concern and excitement. "Margaret," he said, There's something about the land grant I think you need to see. Your grandfather mentioned it in passing, but no one took him seriously at the time. My heart raced as I listened. He described a clause that I hadn't noticed before, one that gave the trustee authority not only over the land, but over the management and potential sale of natural resources. In other words, if I structured the wind farm deal correctly, I could become the sole beneficiary, legally protected from any claims. This was the breakthrough I had been waiting for. I spent the next few nights poring over the documents, cross-referencing every line with the county records and the notes I had collected from the archives. The legal language was old-fashioned, a little convoluted, but clear enough. The trustee had the final say in any sale or development, and all attempts to override that authority were null and void. I felt a thrill I hadn't experienced in years, a mix of empowerment, vindication, and a little giddy excitement. I realized that everything Ryan and Vanessa had tried to do had only strengthened my position, forcing me to uncover a secret advantage I might otherwise have overlooked. Helen was equally thrilled. "Margaret," she said when I called her late that night, "this gives you the leverage to structure the sale exactly the way you want. Millions of dollars, legally protected. No one can touch it." I couldn't stop smiling, imagining the look on Ryan's face when he realized that not only had his plan failed, but it had also ensured my victory in a way that was unassailable. It felt like poetic justice. By the end of the week, I had a meeting scheduled with the wind company. I wanted to present myself as confident, knowledgeable, and in control. I prepared meticulously, reviewing every clause, every potential negotiation point, and rehearsing the answers to questions they might ask. I also made sure Helen was by my side. Her calm authority balanced my excitement, ensuring I didn't let emotions cloud the negotiation. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of agency that was entirely mine. I wasn't just defending the ranch anymore. I was shaping its future. That night, I sat on the porch, sipping tea, watching the sunset over the wide Texas plains. The wind stirred the tall grasses, and I imagined the turbines that might one day dot the horizon. I thought about my grandfather, about the legacy he had entrusted to me, and about the fight I had waged to honor it. I knew challenges lay ahead, but for the first time, I felt like I was no longer reacting. I was leading. I was in control. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself to dream, not just of the sale, not just of the money, but of the freedom and security that came with knowing I had outsmarted greed, deception, and betrayal, and had come out stronger on the other side. The day of the meeting with the wind company finally arrived, and I woke up earlier than usual, unable to sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the ranch. There was a crispness in the air that made the entire world feel sharper, brighter, more alive. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that this wasn't just a business meeting. It was a culmination of everything I had fought for over the last few months. I had defended my inheritance, upheld my grandfather's legacy, and now I had a chance to secure financial freedom that I never imagined I'd have at this stage in my life. Helen arrived promptly, her expression as serious as ever. "Margaret," she said, "remember, confidence is key. They need to know you are the authority here. You run this ranch, and you make the decisions. Nothing is negotiable that you don't approve." I nodded, feeling a thrill of determination. As we drove to the meeting site, I looked out the window at the wide, open Texas plains. The wind swept across the fields, bending the tall grasses in graceful arcs. It was beautiful, and I imagined those same winds powering turbines that could transform my future. The office of the wind company was surprisingly modest, but efficient. A long table dominated the room, and 3 men and 1 woman greeted us warmly but professionally. I introduced myself, shaking hands firmly, making sure my voice conveyed the authority I now carried. Helen stayed slightly behind me, a reassuring presence, ready to interject if needed. The conversation began with standard pleasantries, discussions about acreage, wind patterns, and infrastructure. But I could feel the tension simmering underneath. It was clear they were used to negotiating with developers or hesitant landowners, not someone like me who had legal authority and confidence in equal measure. I presented the documentation carefully, highlighting the original land grant and my legal position as the sole trustee. I watched their eyes widen slightly as I explained the clauses giving me full authority over any sale or development. I could sense the respect growing in the room, and I allowed myself a small, quiet satisfaction. For once, I wasn't being underestimated. For once, my voice carried weight. They asked questions about environmental impact, local approvals, and potential zoning issues, and I answered each one, clearly and precisely. Helen occasionally chimed in to clarify technical legal points, but mostly I spoke, asserting ownership and command with every word. The discussion turned to numbers, and I could feel my pulse quicken. They had a preliminary offer, and it was generous, but I knew I could do better. I asked questions about the long-term profitability, the timeline for construction, and how the revenue would be structured. Each question I asked wasn't just about money, it was about ensuring my position was unassailable, and that Ryan and Vanessa couldn't come back later with claims. The company representatives adjusted their figures, offered new options, and I listened carefully, weighing each one against the facts, against my goals, and against the legal protections I now held. Halfway through the meeting, my phone buzzed in my bag. I ignored it at first, focusing on the negotiations. But then Helen nudged me. I reluctantly checked it and saw a text from Ryan. It was short, almost sneering. "Mom, you don't want to make a mistake here. Don't be foolish." I felt a flush of anger, but I didn't respond. Helen saw the message and simply said, "Ignore it. He's grasping at straws. Focus." And I did. I put my phone away, let my irritation pass, and returned to the table with renewed focus. Ryan could try to intimidate me, but he couldn't override the law. He couldn't touch what was legally mine. By the end of the meeting, we had a preliminary agreement in place. The numbers were even better than I had hoped, and the structure of the deal meant I would retain control over the property until all legal formalities were completed. It was a victory, but I knew better than to celebrate prematurely. There were still hurdles ahead: permits, approvals, and the inevitable attempts by Ryan to interfere. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, knowing that I had navigated a complex negotiation with poise and authority. Driving back to the ranch, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't experienced in years. The plains stretched endlessly on either side of the road, the wind tousling my hair, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and earth. I thought about the journey I had been on, how far I had come since the first letter, the fake medical records, and the threats. Each step had been a test of my resilience, and each one had taught me something new about strength, strategy, and determination. I realized that despite the stress and the challenges, I had grown stronger, more self-assured, and more connected to my own capabilities than ever before. That evening, as I walked the property, I noticed a few subtle changes that reminded me the ranch was alive and needed care. A fence post had rotted, a water trough needed cleaning, and some of the old barns could use repairs. I made mental notes of what needed to be done, knowing I would tackle each task systematically. The ranch wasn't just a financial asset. It was a living, breathing entity, tied to my memories, my family, and my future. Protecting it meant more than securing money. It meant honoring the legacy of the generations who had worked this land before me. But as night fell and I settled into my favorite chair with a glass of wine, I couldn't shake the thought of Ryan. He would not go quietly, and I knew he would try something. It might be subtle, sending letters, questioning the legality of documents, spreading rumors, but I had learned to anticipate his moves. I had learned to stay calm, focused, and prepared. The court had affirmed my authority, the wind company had recognized my position, and Helen was ready to intervene if anything went wrong. I felt a sense of quiet confidence, knowing that I had fortified my position on all fronts. The next morning, my instincts proved correct. A neighbor called to tell me that Ryan had been spotted near the property line, asking questions about the land and talking to surveyors. It was petty, it was transparent, and it was exactly the kind of move I expected. I smiled quietly, knowing that his attempts were harmless in the face of the legal protections I held. I documented the incident, as Helen had advised, and reminded myself that patience and strategy would be my greatest allies. Ryan's frustration was proof that I was succeeding. In the coming weeks, negotiations with the wind company progressed smoothly. Each step reinforced the idea that I had turned a difficult, stressful situation into an opportunity that was both financially and personally empowering. The deal wasn't just about money, it was about control, independence, and the satisfaction of knowing that, despite betrayal and deception, I had emerged victorious. I realized that the ranch, once a source of conflict and anxiety, had become a symbol of resilience, strategy, and empowerment. And with each passing day, I felt more confident that I could protect it, manage it, and ultimately shape its future on my own terms. The weeks that followed the wind company meeting were a delicate balancing act. I spent my mornings on the ranch, walking the fields, checking fences, and ensuring the land was in top condition for the surveyors who would soon be visiting. Every time the wind whipped through the tall grasses, I felt a surge of determination. This land wasn't just soil and pasture. It was history, livelihood, and now, opportunity. By mid-morning, I would retreat to my little home on the property, papers spread across the kitchen table, negotiating contracts and reviewing documents with Helen. It felt almost surreal, this new chapter of my life, one in which I was both caretaker and deal-maker. Helen had been a constant anchor. She reviewed every clause, every figure, and every stipulation, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. The deal with the wind company was complicated: leases, revenue sharing, environmental protections, but each step reinforced the legal authority I held as trustee. Helen reminded me repeatedly, no one could challenge my authority, but that didn't mean I could be careless. We had to anticipate every potential challenge from Ryan, Vanessa, or anyone else who thought they could take a slice of the pie. It was exhausting, but in a way that made me feel alive, more capable than I had in years. Ryan, of course, didn't stay quiet. The petty attempts to undermine me continued, from casual questioning of surveyors to veiled comments at neighbors' gatherings. I learned quickly not to react emotionally. Instead, I documented everything meticulously: dates, times, conversations. Each note, each record, was added to the growing stack of evidence that would protect me if he tried to take legal action. I realized something important. His behavior, though irritating, was predictable. And predictability, in law and strategy, is power. By staying calm and methodical, I was already several steps ahead of him. One afternoon, I received a call from the wind company's lead engineer. They wanted to walk the land with me, to see firsthand where the turbines could go, where the access roads could be built, and how the natural features of the land would affect construction. I agreed, and Helen accompanied me. We drove across the property in an old pickup truck, bouncing over uneven dirt roads, the wind tugging at our hair and clothes. I pointed out landmarks, creeks, fence lines, and patches of land that were unsuitable for construction. The engineers listened attentively, taking notes and asking questions, clearly impressed with my intimate knowledge of the ranch. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that I was more than just a legal authority. I was an expert in my own land. After the walkthrough, I sat down with Helen under the shade of a large oak tree and went through the next steps. The agreement needed finalization, but Helen advised patience. "Margaret," she said, "we're in the driver's seat. The survey is complete, the wind company trusts you, and your title is ironclad. But don't sign anything until every term protects you completely. Ryan and Vanessa will try to interfere, but with careful timing, we can make sure this deal is untouchable." I nodded, appreciating her wisdom. The law had been my shield, and now patience was my sword. The following week brought the first real challenge from Ryan. I received a formal letter, delivered by a process server, claiming that certain clauses in the wind lease were invalid and that he was entitled to a share of the sale proceeds. I stared at the paper, barely able to believe the audacity. The judge's ruling was clear. The original land grant was unassailable, and yet here he was, trying to insert himself into a transaction that he had no legal right to influence. I smiled quietly, reminded once again that desperation makes people reckless. Helen reviewed the claim and calmly prepared our response, outlining how his assertions were baseless and emphasizing that any attempt to interfere would be met with immediate legal action. I felt a surge of empowerment. Ryan could try all he wanted, but the law, our preparation, and the unbreakable evidence we had gathered ensured his efforts were futile. Negotiations with the wind company moved forward smoothly, despite Ryan's attempts. They respected my position, recognizing that the trustee, the rightful decision-maker, was sitting across the table from them. Over several days, we finalized lease terms, revenue sharing, and maintenance schedules. I was meticulous, reviewing every line, questioning every phrase, and ensuring that every dollar, every clause, and every contingency protected my interests. Helen sat beside me, occasionally whispering clarifications, but mostly I felt in control. For the first time in years, I felt the satisfaction of truly owning not just property, but my destiny. The final agreement also included options for future expansion. The wind company saw the potential to develop additional turbines over the years, and I realized this would create long-term financial security, not just for me, but for any charitable or family interests I might wish to support. The thought made me reflect on the future in a way I hadn't allowed myself before. I wasn't just thinking about today, I was thinking decades ahead, about the legacy I would leave and how I could honor my grandfather's vision while also protecting my own independence. But with victory came reflection. Sitting on the porch at sunset, I realized how much had changed in me. The woman who had once been cautious, who had deferred to family members and questioned her own authority, had transformed. I was assertive, confident, and strategic. I had navigated a web of deceit, confronted betrayal, and emerged stronger. Ryan and Vanessa had underestimated me, and that miscalculation had been to my advantage. Every challenge, every attempt to manipulate or intimidate me, had taught me something new about resilience and self-reliance. Helen reminded me that even though the deal was finalized, we needed to prepare for potential last-minute interference. People like Ryan don't quit easily, she said. They'll look for loopholes, technicalities, or even third parties who might try to challenge the lease. We have to be ready, I nodded, feeling a mix of patience and anticipation. I had faced bigger battles already, and this one, though significant, was manageable. Knowledge, preparation, and legal authority were on my side. Finally, the day came to sign the official documents. I walked into the wind company's office, the papers spread across a polished table, and Helen beside me, exuding calm authority. I took the pen in my hand, paused for a moment, and thought about every step that had led to this day. The court hearings, the research, the confrontations, the negotiations. And then I signed. Helen signed. The company representatives signed. The deal was done. I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, the kind that goes beyond money or property. It was the affirmation of my intelligence, perseverance, and integrity. Driving back to the ranch, the sun low in the sky, I allowed myself to imagine what this new chapter would bring. Security, independence, and the freedom to live life on my terms. I thought about the wind turbines that would one day rise over the plains, harnessing the same natural forces that had carried my grandfather's dreams and my own determination. And somewhere in the mix of pride and reflection, I knew one thing. I had fought for my inheritance, navigated betrayal, and emerged victorious, not just financially, but spiritually and emotionally. That evening, as I walked across the fields, feeling the wind stir the tall grasses, I realized I had turned adversity into empowerment. The ranch, once a battleground of deception and greed, had become a symbol of triumph, resilience, and strategic foresight. And I, Margaret Thompson, granddaughter of James Thompson, had secured not only the land, but my place in its history, ready to face whatever came next with confidence, courage, and the knowledge that I could overcome anything. After the deal with the wind company was finalized, the ranch felt different, lighter, almost triumphant, as if the land itself was celebrating alongside me. The weight of the past months, the tension with Ryan and Vanessa, the hours of research and negotiation, had all culminated in this moment. I spent the first morning after signing the papers walking the property, listening to the wind rustle through the tall grasses, and marveling at the thought that soon turbines would rise on the horizon, harnessing the same wind my grandfather had watched as he worked these fields. It was strange, exhilarating, and quietly healing. Helen had suggested taking a short break before dealing with the formalities of transferring funds and updating all the legal records. I welcomed it. For years, I had been consumed by obligations, by the needs of others, and by the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Now I could breathe. I could enjoy the ranch, the quiet beauty of wide-open Texas skies, and the sense of accomplishment that came from knowing I had not only defended my family's legacy, but had also secured my own future. I started each day with tea on the porch, feeling the sun warm my face, and allowed myself to appreciate the stillness, the freedom, and the satisfaction of a hard-fought victory. But of course, life has a way of reminding you that even victories come with complications. Ryan, predictably, did not disappear quietly into the background. I received letters from him questioning aspects of the wind lease, making thinly veiled claims that he had been wronged in some way. I saved each letter, scanned them, and added them to the growing file that documented every attempt he had made to interfere. Helen assured me that there was nothing actionable, that Ryan's claims were frivolous, and that he would be unable to mount any real challenge now that the deal had been executed and the legal authority firmly in my hands. Still, I kept my guard up, knowing that vigilance was the only way to ensure lasting peace. The influx of funds from the wind farm deal was staggering. I remember the day the first wire transfer came through, my heart racing as I logged into the account. It was more money than I had ever imagined handling, and it struck me how different life would be from that point forward. I allowed myself a small moment of indulgence, a glass of champagne on the porch, toasting the sun setting over the plains. I thought about how far I had come, from a woman facing false accusations and family betrayal to one standing in absolute control of her destiny. The feeling was intoxicating, but it was also humbling. I knew I had to manage this new wealth wisely, to honor my grandfather's legacy while also securing my own future. I began the process of financial planning with Helen's guidance. We talked about investments, trusts, charitable donations, and ways to protect the assets from any lingering disputes. I wanted to ensure that everything was structured legally and ethically, in a way that reflected the values my grandfather had instilled in me: responsibility, foresight, and care for the land and community. I also started thinking about personal goals I had long set aside: traveling, taking long writing retreats, and even learning more about ranch management and renewable energy. For the first time in decades, I felt that I had the freedom to pursue my passions without compromise. Of course, managing wealth and legacy also meant managing family dynamics. Ryan continued to be a source of tension, occasionally attempting to manipulate situations in his favor, but his efforts were increasingly transparent. Vanessa, once so confident in her schemes, had begun to fade into the background, perhaps realizing that their plans had failed and that I was firmly in control. I made a conscious decision not to let their behavior consume me emotionally. I responded to necessary communication with calm professionalism, and everything else I filtered out. Protecting my peace was as important as protecting the ranch itself. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch reviewing letters from neighbors congratulating me on the wind farm deal, I realized something profound. This whole journey had changed me. I wasn't just Margaret Thompson, the woman who inherited a ranch. I was a strategist, a negotiator, and a leader. I had faced deceit, intimidation, and betrayal, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. The experience had taught me the value of trusting my instincts, of preparing meticulously, and of never underestimating my own abilities. I felt a renewed sense of confidence that extended beyond the ranch and into every aspect of my life. The community response was another unexpected gift. People who had known my grandfather, who had watched me grow up on this land, reached out to congratulate me. They shared memories, old photographs, and stories about the ranch's history. I realized how important it was not just to preserve the land, but to honor its place in the community. This legacy wasn't mine alone. It was intertwined with generations of neighbors, friends, and family who had been part of the ranch's story. I felt a sense of pride, knowing that I had not only defended my inheritance, but had also strengthened the connection between the ranch and those who cherished it. As the days turned into weeks, I began to explore other ways to engage with the property. The wind farm deal had secured financial stability, but the ranch itself was still alive and full of potential. I considered creating educational programs, perhaps even small retreats for women like me, who wanted to reconnect with nature, learn about ranch life, or find inspiration in the quiet strength of the land. The possibilities felt endless, and the sense of freedom that came from knowing I could shape the ranch's future according to my vision was exhilarating. Even Ryan's attempts at disruption became almost trivial in comparison to the sense of empowerment I felt. He tried letters, subtle inquiries, and even casual remarks aimed at unsettling me, but they had lost their power. I had learned to recognize manipulation, to anticipate schemes, and to respond only when necessary. My confidence was now rooted not in legal victories alone, but in the knowledge that I had grown into a woman capable of managing both land and life with clarity, foresight, and grace. By the end of the season, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and peace. The wind company had begun preliminary planning, surveyors were mapping the land, and the ranch itself had never looked better. I spent evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the wind sweep across the plains, and allowing myself to simply be. I thought about the journey, the battles with Ryan and Vanessa, the court victories, the meticulous planning, and the eventual triumph, and realized how much stronger, wiser, and more self-assured I had become. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to dream about the future, not just in financial terms, but in terms of personal growth, adventure, and fulfillment. I thought about travel, education, and experiences I had put aside for decades. I thought about writing, about mentoring younger women, and about the possibility of passing on the lessons I had learned. The ranch had become more than land or inheritance. It was a symbol of resilience, empowerment, and the rewards of perseverance. And I felt, for the first time, that I truly belonged not just to the ranch, but to my own life, fully and unapologetically. Life after the sale settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal. Mornings on the ranch became sacred to me, a quiet time to walk the fields, breathe in the wind, and remember the journey that had led me here. The financial security the wind farm deal provided gave me freedom I had never known, yet the weight of the months-long battle lingered like a faint shadow. I would sometimes glance at the fences or the barns and remember the late nights of research, the confrontation with Ryan and Vanessa, the tense courtroom moments. And every time, I felt a surge of pride. I had navigated deception, intimidation, and betrayal, and come out victorious. But the story of the ranch, and of my own transformation, was far from over. One afternoon, as I sorted through correspondence from the wind company, I found a letter that made me pause. It was an unexpected legal notice, not from Ryan this time, but from a distant relative who had suddenly discovered a claim to the Thompson Ranch. The letter was polite but insistent, referencing obscure family ties and old wills that nobody had ever mentioned. I nearly laughed, knowing the timing couldn't be more suspicious. This was clearly someone hoping to take advantage of my new wealth. I called Helen immediately, who, after reading it carefully, reassured me that the claim was frivolous and had no legal standing. Still, the letter reminded me that victory doesn't mean the battles stop. It means you must remain vigilant, ready to defend what you have earned. I also began noticing changes in my own perspective. For years, my focus had been outward, protecting the ranch, negotiating with Ryan and Vanessa, proving my competence. Now, my focus was turning inward. I reflected on the courage, patience, and resilience I had discovered in myself. I had confronted people who doubted me, faced my own fears of failure, and realized that my strength was not just in legal documents or contracts, but in my ability to stay calm, think clearly, and act decisively. These lessons extended beyond the ranch. They influenced how I approached friendships, community relationships, and even my personal ambitions. The community had responded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Neighbors who had once kept their distance were reaching out, congratulating me, sharing memories, and offering support for future projects on the ranch. Some even expressed interest in helping me create educational programs or retreats, inspired by the history and beauty of the land. It was humbling to realize that the ranch wasn't just my inheritance. It was a symbol, a piece of living history that connected people across generations. And as I listened to these stories, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that I had protected something far greater than property. I had safeguarded a legacy. But with newfound confidence came reflection on Ryan and Vanessa. They had lost, yes, but they had also forced me to grow, to dig deeper, and to discover strengths I didn't know I had. I realized that the resentment I had carried toward them was slowly transforming into a kind of gratitude. Their schemes, their attempts to intimidate me, and their greed had tested me in ways that nothing else could. I had risen to the challenge, not just surviving, but thriving, and I began to see the experience as a turning point, a moment in life that redefined who I was and what I was capable of. Around this time, I also began to explore new opportunities that had been out of reach before. With the financial security from the wind farm deal, I considered traveling, attending workshops, and even pursuing long-held personal projects. I thought about writing a memoir, reflecting on the lessons of the ranch, the family struggles, and the triumphs. I imagined retreats where women of my age could reconnect with nature, learn about resilience, and find inspiration in the quiet strength of the land. Each idea was a reminder that while the battle for the ranch had been fierce, the victory it brought was not only financial, it was personal, liberating, and transformative. One morning, as I was checking on a newly repaired fence line, I noticed Ryan driving slowly along the edge of the property. My initial reaction was irritation, but then I reminded myself that I was no longer reactive in the ways I once had been. He had lost his legal authority months ago, and any attempt at intimidation now was futile. I simply watched him drive past, documented it quietly, and returned to my work. There was no satisfaction in confrontation anymore. The real triumph was in knowing that I had outsmarted him, secured the ranch, and maintained my peace of mind. The wind company began preliminary construction planning in earnest, and surveyors walked the land, marking plots for turbines and access roads. I accompanied them, answering questions, pointing out areas to avoid, and sharing my knowledge of the land's history. The experience was exhilarating. My grandfather's vision, my own perseverance, and the ingenuity of modern renewable energy converged on this property. I felt a profound sense of purpose, knowing that my actions were not just preserving the ranch, but also contributing to a sustainable future. The thought brought a deep satisfaction I hadn't expected, connecting the legacy of the past with the promise of the future. Evenings were now a time of reflection. I sat on the porch, sipping tea, watching the sun cast golden light across the plains, and felt a rare stillness. The battles, the stress, and the fear that had dominated the previous months had faded into memory. What remained was clarity, empowerment, and gratitude. I thought about the long road I had traveled, the courage I had discovered, and the resilience that had carried me through. I realized that true independence wasn't just financial. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. I had reclaimed control over my life, my land, and my destiny, and it was a feeling unlike any other. There were still decisions to be made, of course: how to invest wisely, how to protect future interests, how to honor the land and its community. But I approached each choice with confidence, knowing that I had the tools, knowledge, and foresight to make the best decisions. I felt connected to a larger purpose, understanding that my victory was not merely about money or property, but about the affirmation of strength, integrity, and perseverance. Every day I spent on the ranch, every conversation I had, and every decision I made reinforced the sense that I had earned not just security, but freedom. By the end, I realized something deeply satisfying. The challenges, the betrayals, and the struggles had all served a purpose. They had forced me to grow, to assert myself, and to uncover inner strengths I had long overlooked. The ranch was no longer a place of conflict, but a sanctuary, a platform for empowerment, and a symbol of triumph. And as the wind swept across the plains, stirring the tall grasses and whispering through the old oak trees, I felt a profound sense of peace, accomplishment, and readiness for whatever came next, knowing that I, Margaret Thompson, had not just survived the storm, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and truly free. By the time the wind turbines began to take shape on the horizon, the ranch felt transformed, not just in structure, but in spirit. The plains, once quiet with only the whisper of the wind and the chirping of birds, now carried a sense of purpose, energy, and possibility. I spent hours walking along the edges of the property, surveying the progress, talking to engineers, and making small adjustments when necessary. Every decision I made, every suggestion I contributed, reminded me that this was my land, my responsibility, and my triumph. I had fought tooth and nail to get here, and now the power of choice, the ability to shape what happened on these acres, was entirely mine. Ryan, as expected, had not completely disappeared. There were still occasional letters, terse emails, and veiled comments aimed at intimidating me or questioning the legality of the sale. But each attempt had grown weaker, almost laughable, compared to the legal and strategic groundwork Helen and I had established. One morning, I received a particularly desperate email from him, claiming he had discovered some obscure historical precedent that might nullify the wind farm lease. I read it carefully, smiled, and set it aside. Helen assured me there was nothing of substance, and the calm certainty in her voice was reassuring. I realized how far I had come. I no longer reacted with fear or anger. I simply assessed, verified, and moved on. The power was in my preparation, my knowledge, and my confidence. With the ranch secure and my legal authority unquestionable, I began to turn my attention inward, exploring possibilities that had long been dormant. I considered traveling to places I had only dreamed of, writing retreats in New England, art workshops in Santa Fe, and even a long, reflective trip to Europe to explore the countryside my grandfather had once admired in pictures. Each idea felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been neglected for too long. The wind farm deal had given me more than money. It had given me freedom. And freedom, I realized, was a gift that demanded courage, creativity, and willingness to embrace new experiences. One afternoon, as I walked along a path lined with mesquite trees, I noticed a small group of neighbors gathered near the edge of the property. They waved as I approached, their faces bright with curiosity and warmth. They had come to discuss possible community projects, educational programs, youth workshops, and environmental initiatives that could benefit from the wind farm's presence. I listened carefully, offering suggestions, sharing insights from my experience managing the ranch, and encouraging them to take the lead in ways that aligned with my grandfather's vision of stewardship and community engagement. It was gratifying to see how the ranch could be a source of inspiration and growth, not just for me, but for others. Despite these new ventures, there was one more challenge I hadn't anticipated, a subtle, unexpected twist that tested my resourcefulness. The wind company informed me that a small section of the land designated for turbines contained an old, unrecorded easement, granting access to a utility company for maintenance purposes. While minor in legal terms, the presence of the easement meant that we needed to negotiate terms to ensure that the wind turbines could still be installed without complications. I felt a flicker of tension, but it was nothing compared to the battles I had faced before. This was a logistical challenge, not a fight for control. I met with Helen and the engineers, reviewed maps, and strategized solutions. By the end of the day, we had devised a plan that respected the easement while allowing construction to proceed smoothly. The resolution reminded me that flexibility, intelligence, and calm deliberation were just as important as authority and preparation. In those weeks, I also found myself reflecting on the personal lessons I had learned. I realized that resilience wasn't simply about fighting others. It was about understanding your own strength, recognizing opportunities, and responding to challenges with clarity and composure. The betrayal I had faced, the deception from my own family, and the constant threats had all been catalysts for growth. I had discovered patience I didn't know I had, strategic thinking under pressure, and the confidence to assert myself when it mattered most. And more than anything, I had learned the importance of trusting my instincts and honoring my own judgment. One morning, Helen and I hosted a brief tour of the property for the wind company executives. As we walked through the fields, I spoke about the history of the land, the importance of preserving its integrity, and my grandfather's vision. I noticed, with a quiet sense of satisfaction, that the engineers were listening intently, not just to practical guidance, but to the story of stewardship and legacy that I conveyed. I realized then that the ranch was more than just a financial asset. It was a living, breathing symbol of resilience, dedication, and ethical responsibility. My grandfather's spirit seemed to whisper in the wind, affirming that the battles fought had been worth it. Evenings on the porch became my sanctuary. I would sit with a cup of tea or a glass of wine, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in pinks, purples, and golds. The turbines, still under construction, stood like silent sentinels, harnessing the wind and reflecting the light in glimmers of metallic sheen. I felt a profound sense of connection to the land, to my grandfather, and to myself. Every gust of wind, every shift of sunlight across the fields, reminded me of the journey I had undertaken and the triumph I had achieved. In quiet moments, I allowed myself to dream. I imagined retreats for women seeking inspiration, programs for youth interested in environmental stewardship, and opportunities to teach others about resilience, strategy, and the value of standing firm in the face of adversity. The wind farm had given me more than money. It had given me leverage, influence, and the freedom to shape experiences that could impact lives beyond my own. And for the first time in years, I felt truly unbounded, capable of envisioning a future where my choices were entirely my own. By the end, I understood something crucial. The journey had been about more than reclaiming property or outsmarting a deceitful family. It had been about discovering my own power, embracing independence, and learning to navigate challenges with wisdom and grace. The ranch, the wind turbines, and the freedom they represented were tangible symbols of that journey. And as the construction crews worked and the wind carried its steady song across the plains, I felt a quiet confidence that no one, not Ryan, not Vanessa, not any unexpected twist, could undermine what I had earned. I had learned that true strength lay not in wealth or control alone, but in clarity, resilience, and the courage to claim the life I deserved. The day the first wind turbine was officially erected felt like a celebration, though there were no banners, no speeches, just the quiet hum of machinery, the wind sweeping through the plains, and the sense of history unfolding before my eyes. I walked the property that morning, the sun casting long golden shadows across the grass, and marvelled at the sheer scale of what had been accomplished. The turbine towered above the land, a symbol of progress, perseverance, and the power of determination. I felt a mix of awe and pride, realizing that the victory had been more than legal, financial, or practical. It had been deeply personal. I had reclaimed my family legacy, outsmarted deceit, and asserted control over my life, in a way I had never imagined possible. Helen and I stood together near the base of the turbine, watching as the construction crew completed the final adjustments. She smiled at me, a quiet acknowledgement of the battles we had fought together and the triumph we had achieved. "You've done more than protect the ranch," she said softly. "You've transformed it, and yourself, in the process." I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. It wasn't just about the turbines or the money. It was about reclaiming agency, discovering inner strength, and realizing that I was capable of more than I had ever given myself credit for. Every step of this journey had shaped me, tested me, and ultimately strengthened me. I thought about Ryan and Vanessa, and a part of me expected bitterness to linger, but it didn't. They had chosen deception and greed, and I had chosen clarity, patience, and strategy. Their defeat had been necessary, but it no longer occupied my thoughts. I felt compassion, strangely enough, not for their schemes, but for the ways in which fear and entitlement had clouded their judgment. I realized that holding on to resentment would only weigh me down. My triumph lay in my freedom, my foresight, and my ability to live my life on my own terms, unencumbered by the chaos of their choices. As the turbine blades began to turn for the first time, catching the wind and generating energy, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The sound of the blades slicing through the air was rhythmic, almost meditative, and I imagined my grandfather's eyes on the plains, proud of the land and the woman who had inherited it. I thought about the history embedded in this soil, the generations who had worked it, the sweat and dedication poured into every fence, every barn, every acre, and I felt a deep connection to them. This wasn't just a business victory. It was a restoration of legacy, a preservation of values, and a testament to resilience and foresight. In the days that followed, I began to explore ways to engage with the community more deeply. I hosted small gatherings for neighbours, sharing stories about the land, teaching lessons about renewable energy, and encouraging younger generations to appreciate the importance of stewardship and perseverance. I wanted the ranch to be more than property. I wanted it to be a living classroom, a source of inspiration, and a place where people could witness the power of resilience and strategic thinking firsthand. Each interaction reinforced the sense of purpose I had found, reminding me that legacy isn't just about ownership, it's about influence, mentorship, and the opportunity to leave a positive mark on the world. I also finally allowed myself to pursue personal dreams I had shelved for decades. I booked a trip to the mountains of New Mexico, taking painting supplies along to capture the landscapes that had long inspired me. I planned a writing retreat in Vermont, where I could begin documenting the story of the ranch, the battles fought, and the lessons learned. Every decision was guided not by obligation or fear, but by curiosity, joy, and the desire to expand my horizons. I was, for the first time in years, fully and unapologetically living life on my own terms. Even Ryan and Vanessa's occasional attempts to meddle had diminished to almost nothing. I realized that their greatest power had always been my hesitation to assert myself. Once I had claimed authority, stood firm, and documented every step, their influence evaporated. I no longer needed to worry about them. Their presence was no longer a threat, merely a reminder of the journey I had endured. That recognition brought a quiet, steady confidence, a sense that I had not only won the battle for the ranch, but had also won something much larger: the knowledge that I could navigate adversity with integrity and strength. One evening, sitting on the porch with the wind whistling through the grasses and the turbines turning steadily in the distance, I reflected on how much I had grown. The woman who had once doubted herself, who had feared confrontation and second-guessed her abilities, had transformed into someone resilient, strategic, and fiercely independent. The battles I had fought, the legal threats, the family betrayal, the negotiations, had not broken me. They had honed me. I realized that this strength, this clarity, and this confidence would carry into every future endeavor, every choice, and every dream I chose to pursue. Looking across the ranch, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons learned, the allies found in Helen and in the community, and the resilience that had carried me through months of stress, uncertainty, and challenge. Gratitude for the freedom and security the wind farm had provided, and for the opportunity to finally live according to my own rules. The ranch was no longer just land. It was a symbol of empowerment, a legacy preserved, and a future secured. Every gust of wind through the plains felt like affirmation, a reminder that the effort, courage, and perseverance had been worth it. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the turbines and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a quiet sense of completion. The battles had been fought, the land secured, and my future established. I had learned that true victory wasn't about defeating others. It was about discovering your own strength, embracing your independence, and honoring your values. The ranch, the turbines, and the legacy they represented were proof of that truth. I felt a lightness in my heart, a freedom that I hadn't known in decades, and a profound confidence that whatever challenges or opportunities lay ahead, I would meet them with the same resilience, clarity, and courage that had brought me here. As night fell and the wind continued to move across the plains, I sat on the porch one last time that day, reflecting on the journey from fear and uncertainty to triumph and empowerment. I thought about the lessons learned, the battles won, and the life reclaimed. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the sounds of the land and the gentle turning of the turbines, I realized that the true inheritance my grandfather had passed down was not just the ranch, or even the money, but the strength, resilience, and courage to stand firm, act decisively, and claim my life on my own terms. That, I knew, was a legacy worth more than anything else.